Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending upon where you are. Today's part 2 of the IoT or OT, Learning from the Death Star. I think it's very appropriate since this last Saturday was May the 4th. If you know that joke online that says, "May the 4th be with you," or my favorite one, which is Revenge of the 5th. Anyways, so today we're going to talk about the second part of our presentation on IoT and OT, operational technology and Internet of Things, and how it kind of relates to the Death Star, which I think we really covered in the first section. Joining me today is Robert DeRook from Indiana University. Say hi, Rob.
Hello, everybody.
And we're just going to go through and talk now about some of the solutions to some of the problems that we see with IoT and some of the things that we need to understand. This is something that I saw that SaltStack had at their booth in RSA conference this year, and I thought it was really cute, and they stole my idea because I already thought about this. I thought that IoT sometimes seems harmless, but in reality ends up being a method by which people gain access to networks. A friend of mine once said, "I don't really care if somebody hacks into my vacuum cleaner. What are they going to do if they did?" And I think that's a naive approach, because it's not so much that they hacked into your vacuum cleaner. Yeah, maybe you can't vacuum now. But it's the fact that typically once a hacker hacks into a device, then they move laterally within the network that that device is in order to hack into other things. And that's where they can get into business critical operations. And so you don't always see that this little thermal port in the Death Star was what led to the Death Star being destroyed, but you also don't see that this vacuum cleaner, whatever it is, leads to that. So we kind of talked about that last time and talked about a lot of different IoT devices being hacked, being in the news. I think there's another thing that I just read over the weekend talking about local governments being like a huge attack vector or a target for a lot of hackers, and some of the reasons why. But that's for another presentation. So in the part 1, if you want to go back and watch part 1 if you missed it, we talk about the terminology for IoT and OT, what are the different terms that we use. We talked about how many billions of devices are connected now, what are some of the concerns. We talked about actual hacks and threats and trends that we are seeing. We see that it's a part of cyber warfare these days. And some of the simple things that, everyone talks about. I think I saw online this weekend, it was a funny little cartoon, and it says, change your password like your underwear. And I thought, oh, that's kind of gross. And I don't want to change my password every day, but at least we understand that default passwords should not be allowed, and yet IoT devices are routinely using default passwords. So that's like the simplest thing that, back in the 90s we were saying change your password. So why is it still that we have these default passwords and people aren't changing them? So that's one of the issues, but it's not the only issue by far. And the default password, as one of my former clients who just retired told me when I was talking about this presentation, he said, "Oh, this reminds me of Spaceballs with the password for the space shield, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you remember that scene from Spaceballs, like Darth Helmet's like, what idiot uses this as a password? And then the Emperor guy comes in there and says, oh, that's the same one as on my luggage. Anyway, so yeah, that's an issue. This article just came out between me doing 2 different ones. You can check it out. I've got the URL down there on the bottom of the slide, talking about millions of devices, IoT devices, that have a peer-to-peer network connection in them that are open and can be exploited. So there's millions of these devices out there that have this weakness. And I think that this is just more proof of what I was talking about last week. Like within a week of doing a presentation, we're already talking about additional hacks that are happening with IoT devices. And one of the things that people are starting to do is set up honeypots to try and catch hackers. So let's set up a fake one. This helps us, well, some people use it to protect their networks, but I think it kind of helps us actually see how hackers are breaking into things. Also proof of concept for business executives who don't think it's an issue. We can say, well, look, here's a honeypot, and look, it's already been hacked. That kind of, so it's a proof of concept, yes, but it's also something we can use to kind of deter hackers into another location. Also just waste their time, which is not really a defense, but it's a way to kind of reduce the risk, right? And that is to have them waste their time hacking into systems they can. Now, one thing, a concept that we talk about, or I talk about all the time because I'm an auditor, is IT governance. And there's one part of IT governance, there's two main buckets. And if you read COBIT, they have like 5 different things listed there, but there's really just 2, right? One is to make sure that IT brings value to the organization. And the second one is ensure that the risks are identified and addressed. That's the 2 things about governance that you're trying to do. And yes, there's accountability and visibility and transparency and all that's a part of that, and documentation. But there's really just these 2 buckets we're talking about, right? We want to make sure that we're bringing value to the organization, and we want to make sure we're identifying risks. What I don't see in industry is IoT governance or OT governance. Now, it's implied, right, that we make sure that OT and IoT bring value to the organization and that we identify and address the risks related to those devices. But the problem is, there's a couple problems, we'll talk about that later, but those are the things that we still want to do with those devices. So we just should be talking about governance, which, you know, COSO, the model COSO does. You can look that up. It's more for enterprise-wide risk management. But and COBIT, which is a standard that the IT Governance Institute came out with, part of ISACA, the Information System Audit and Control Association, and it does focus on IT. It does talk about all connected devices, so IoT and OT are kind of underneath that as well. So we should really focus in on making sure that it brings value and we address the risks, right? So with that being said, now let's start looking at some of the things that we're going to cover this time. One of the things that I find with IoT and, let's say, operational technology, and to a lesser extent IoT, is if you think of IoT, typically there's almost no support period, right? When you buy a vacuum cleaner, you have a warranty with it. But with that warranty is no patch management. There's no updates of software promised to you. You have no control of it, generally, if you have those items. Maybe you buy security cameras, consumer security cameras, or the Ring doorbell, or whatever item that you're buying. There's almost no support for that item as far as what we're talking about, vulnerability management, the typical types of service level agreements that you'd get from a production environment or an enterprise environment if you're buying items. Like if you buy a server, you can have a 4-hour guaranteed within 4 hours that you'd have a technician on site to help you with that server. You don't get that with an IoT device generally. They have frequent models, so they're almost every year, maybe even multiple times a year, they come out with a new model. They have a wide range of different models and maybe even different applications that they're using. Generally what they want you to do is just replace it. That's their business model. That's how they make money. They want you to say, I don't need that camera anymore. Let me go out and buy the newest one. Right? That's what they're trying to get you to do. They don't want you to mess with it. For them, their cost is so low that for them to support it, they're going to start losing money if they try to support it for 5-10 years. And if you think about it from a physical security standpoint, when you design an environment where you're going to have cameras and all that stuff, you're looking at like at least a 10-year period that you want support for a device. You don't want to be replacing your cameras every 10 years, right? You want it to last for, you know, a good long period of time. But usually that's not the case when you look at IoT typical devices. They want you to just replace them. There's usually limited software for those, and many of them today are just cloud-based. If you think about your thermostat or your even your home cameras now, everything just goes to the cloud and you control everything from the cloud. People like that because they can control it from their cell phones. It does make everything a lot easier for you. But one of the issues you end up running into that is there's eventually going to be a time when that cloud-based service may not be able to support the particular version of the camera that you have or the device that you have, and you're going to have to be forced to go out and upgrade. Now, on the other side, an operational technology or the typical like SCADA type of things, you have longer support periods for those things. The models do not come out quite as often. They have a little bit more longevity because they know that you're buying something for, perhaps it's for a plant or a factory or a water treatment plant, and you're expecting those items to last maybe 30 years, right? So their PLC units that they make, the programmable logic controllers, they make those items and they're trying to make them so they last as long as they possibly can. So they have more of a longevity with them. There's usually a narrower range. There's not as many different models of them available out there. They are generally made to be repaired, not replaced, although in some cases they are replaceable. We just pull out a unit, stick a new unit in there. But many of them can be repaired, and that's the model that they have. They have very limited software as well, like especially on-site software, which is typically what it is. It may not even update as often as new models come out, or it may update more often than as models come out. So it kind of just depends on what industry you're in. Most of those are not cloud-based, they're on-prem. Knowing clients that I have that have water districts and stuff, some of them are still running in their plant Windows XP because the software, the newest software that they have that runs on Windows 10 doesn't work with the hardware that they have. And now you've created a new risk by having an old operating system like Windows XP, but not only just Windows XP being the old operating system, that software they have is also old. And so they may not be supporting that software anymore. And if you think about it, if you're expecting a life of 30 years out of the system, there has to be plans in place to keep up with new versions of Windows that come out, new hardware that comes out, whether it's 32 or 64-bit. You have to have all of that has to be planned out. And if you're buying it today, if IP6 isn't on their roadmap, the network may not necessarily work. You may have to continue to use IP version 4 on a network where everything else is IP version 6 because those older devices don't support them. And so with OT, we still have those problems that we have to deal with and address that we don't typically have in regular IT. And so I made this little graphic to kind of show you, like, showing you side by side. Let's say the numbers here on the screen, the 1, 2, 3, 4, that's maybe when a new piece of hardware is coming out, a new version of, like, let's say cameras. And then you have software that's being updated for it. And eventually, the camera that you have may have software that doesn't work with it. And you either have to keep that software or make your own software, or you have to upgrade the hardware to get the new software. And so I have a little bit better of a graphic here that might show you some kind of overlapping. On the top, I have the hardware cycle. So let's say Model 1 comes out this year, 2019. It's only projected to be supported until 2025, right? However, the software you have is only projected to be good for 2 or 3 years. And then you're going to upgrade to the next software, and then you're going to upgrade to the next software. But the next software after that may not work with the model that you have. And so this is the problem that we run into, is that look at it from the manufacturer standpoint. And we'll get back to this in a little bit because this is some of the stuff that we're starting to see. The manufacturer, in order for them to continue to support Model 1 that they made, in 2019, when they're running on Model 5 now, it becomes more expensive. So typically what ends up happening is a manufacturer will support 2 or 3 models back, so Model 5, Model 4, Model 3, because the cost of keeping up with Model 2 and Model 1's hardware and all that stuff becomes much more expensive. Now, every industry is different, so you're going to see different levels of support for all of them. I'm not trying to say that this is, what it is for water district type of tools and technology or whatever, but when you look at, you're going to find something similar to this, that the software and the hardware is going to be kind of lined up with each other, and there's going to be a point where they deviate, and you're going to have to make a decision that you're going to have to upgrade hardware in order to keep up with the software, or continue to run the hardware with the old software. Now, some people may say, hey, just run the old software and the old hardware indefinitely. Run it till it all dies. Well, the problem is the vulnerabilities get introduced into those systems, and we are not able to address those. So how do we address those and trying to get the maximum life out of the hardware and the software that we have? And the vendors want you to update, because that's how they make their money. Well, let's just be honest with that. That's what their business model is. So we have to kind of work some type of solution in there, either when we decide that we're upgrading, we're building a water plant or water treatment plant, we have to decide that, yes, the pipes are going to last for 30 years or whatever it's going to be, or 2 decades, but the logical control systems and all that is going to have to be updated as we go. So there has to be some level of flexibility with it. You may be able to look out 10 years in technology, but you really can't look past 10 years in technology. Much as we want to, if 10 years ago, I would not be imagining where we are today, right? Even the best minds, a lot of things 10 years ago that people thought would be happening still aren't happening, and things that people didn't even think of are now happening. So there has to be this dynamic or constant course correction in our strategic plan as we look at new software and hardware going forward, right? So additional issues that you're going to have with some of these IoT devices is vulnerability management and patch availability. Again, making patches available for older and older systems, it becomes expensive for the vendor. So even Microsoft doesn't support Windows XP anymore. There's no more patches for it. Even if a vulnerability is found, they're not patching it because it's not supported by them anymore. It's very expensive for them to have a whole set of teams doing it. So we're kind of forced to upgrade, whether we like it or not. And that's not a bad thing, because we want to have the newest, the best, the most secure. But that lack of patch availability puts us at risk if there's known threats to it. The other thing is infrastructure support. So when you put everything in IT and you say, hey, we're going to make everything TCP/IP, the protocol that the internet runs on, that's great because the internet's running on it. The problem is that protocol is being replaced and being upgraded. Is our infrastructure going to be able to support it going forward? So a lot of our devices may have hard-coded TCP/IP version 4 built into it, but not version 6. So that may hold us back from implementing, IP version 6 within our enterprise, because part of it won't support it. Sometimes hardware and the software have separate support cycles, and we have to kind of do that. And with most items, we have what we call mainstream support and then extended support. So mainstream is when they're supporting the device or the software, and then it gets to a point where they say, okay, well, we're not going to make any new features for that software, but we're going to continue to support it at a lesser extent before we actually don't support it anymore. So know that there's not a night and day difference. It kind of like gradually goes down afterwards. And one of the other issues I have is, or I found, is that a lot of the IoT and OT devices are a part of the information technology IT infrastructure, but they have separate management. So in building automation systems, it might be engineers running those systems while the network is being ran by the network system admins. And so you have two different departments using the same items, having the same risk or interrelated risks, without that connection on the cybersecurity side between the two. There needs to be a bridge between the engineers who are running the plant or the factory and the IT folks that are running the network and all the other network and computers and all that items. So there needs to be this connection between the two, collaboration between them is, I think, appropriate word. Collaboration, or I would also say a shared responsibility, right? So they both have shared responsibility in this. But what I don't see is a lot of talk back and forth between the two groups. I see them kind of like siloed, and when security measures come in, IT is like, okay, this is what we have to do, and then the OT folks say, hey, I want to put this on the network, and the IT people are like, hey, no, you can't. Or the engineers put something on the network, don't even tell the network guys, and the network system admins are clueless that there's a risk. And so they are not implementing items on their network to compensate for the lack of controls on the OT environment. we have to have a holistic approach. We can't really divide things into IT, OT, and IoT. We really need to look at technology as a whole, generically, and how that brings value to the organization and how we address the risk to technology as a whole. So that's where we have to move towards. Now, there has been some legislations and some attempts at accountability. Most of these are focusing currently on manufacturers of devices. And there was a Senate bill that was proposed that would have had some impact on IoT devices. However, that was referred to committee, and I think it's in committee now, so it may go there to die. I don't know. We'll see how that turns out, but it didn't get any traction in Congress, unfortunately, because this is a very important thing that Congress really does need to deal with if they want to have some legislation around it so that they can start holding manufacturers accountable for making less than secure devices. I mean, we hold manufacturers accountable for safety issues, but not security issues. And sometimes those security issues are directly related to safety, especially when it comes to medical equipment, IoT medical equipment. There may be a life safety issue related to that product or that device. So you will see far more, we'll talk about here in a minute, far more support for dealing with security to medical devices because of a life safety issue than probably any other areas. But they're starting to come. So the Federal Trade Commission was talking about to start holding businesses responsible for failing to implement good cybersecurity practices. So you're starting to see this, but it hasn't really borne a whole lot of fruit right now. But in other words, they're saying, hey, you need to take cybersecurity seriously, and we're going to start holding you accountable for not doing what you know you ought to be doing. So that's a good thing. Now, FDA is coming out with, hey, you need to make medical devices need to have updates to software, and they're easing the ability for the review process for those items so that medical devices can be updated faster. Because they felt that this was one of the issues, because if someone wanted to make an update to a device, then a patch or something to it, then it had to go through FDA approval again, and that can be a very costly process. So they're trying to streamline that process and make it easier. So they're figuring out, okay, when do we actually need to re-review the device, and when is it just a patch that we don't care, it just needs to go into production. So there's some work going on there, and hopefully that can continue to move forward, especially with medical devices. California legislation, I mean, there's a law in California that basically says you have to have reasonable security measures. And I say, hey, that's really good. Well, what's reasonable to me is not what's reasonable to our legislature. Reasonable security features, I have a whole long list of them, right? You know, updates on a regular basis, patch management, no default passwords, you know, those are the little things. They define reasonable security measures as no default passwords, and that's it. So I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, right? This is the lowest hanging fruit possible to try and fix the problem. Yes, passwords need to be addressed, but it's like the lowest possible hanging fruit. There's so many other things that we need to do, like secure coding practices in the very beginning, security by design at the beginning, right? This is not being addressed by the legislation. Now, maybe because connected devices, there's billions of them, maybe they're saying, oh, this is too much of a onerous thing. If we put, you know, that they have to do all these other things, it's going to put people out of business. And they can always come up with the requirements and then say, hey, we're going to phase these in. First thing is no default passwords. Second thing is, you know, secure coding practice, you know, and then ease it in, but they didn't get into all of that. Now, they're legislatures, so I don't expect them to know a lot about cybersecurity. That's why we have cybersecurity professionals. But I really think they should have done more to consult with the cybersecurity folks in general. So it's a good first step, but it's a very tiny step, unfortunately. Now, the UK has a code of practice for consumer IoT. Now, this is where our legislation should have been working towards. And look at their number one requirement is no default passwords. Great, same thing California did. Next thing is implement a vulnerability disclosure policy, keeping people aware of what vulnerabilities are out there. And then their third one is keep software up to date. Those are the three main things that they think are the core of their code of practice that they want IoT folks to adopt. And I really like that the UK is actually taking a step forward. Outside of any other body out there coming up with standards for IoT, they're coming forward and saying, hey, this is what we need to do for consumer. And they're specifically saying consumer IoT security, which is only good for everybody else, right? Because if we get IoT on the consumer side, then obviously in the enterprise side is going to follow and generally is ahead. Securely store credentials and sensitive data, communicate security is a fifth one. Sixth one is minimize exposure attack surfaces, so secure by design, right? 7 is ensure that software integrity, in other words, that software can't be modified. 8 is ensure the personal data is protected. In other words, if there's any personal data on there that people can't just get it. So this would require that you encrypt the information of usernames and passwords, which I know everybody says, oh, who doesn't encrypt their username and passwords? As an auditor, I see it all the time, especially in IoT devices where that information is stored in memory but not encrypted. That one kind of does, and there was a question I had earlier on this. And by the way, if you have any questions, just go into the Bright Talk channel and ask a question and we'll answer it. One of the questions I had earlier was about GDRP, the European standard for data privacy, and that's why this one exists in the UK Consumer IoT Security Code of Practice. But that's obviously one that we should be concerned about everywhere else too, not just in the European Union. Make systems resilient to outages is number 9. 10 is monitor system for telemetry data. 11 is make it easy to delete personal data. That's another GDRP requirement. 12, make installation and maintenance easy. So in other words, you don't have to be a genius to set up your VCR, right? Because that's now an IoT device, not your VCR. That's a bad, that dates me, doesn't it? Your DVR device. 13, validate input data. So in other words, you're going to protect things from injection type of attacks that are typically available. So you can see with the UK Code of Practice for consumer IoT security, it's fairly comprehensive, much more comprehensive than the California legislation that just passed. And it is something that is targeted towards the original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, the people that make the devices. So it's targeted towards them. It's not really targeted toward me as a consumer. They do have some guide on their website for consumers and what you should do, and it tell you to, change your password and do updates and all the stuff that you hear about your computers, doing the same stuff there. So this is more focused towards the manufacturers of devices. As consumers, our way that we make our voice heard is we don't buy devices that don't meet these security requirements. And it's really tough. I went into Best Buy and I started asking about security related to items, and they're like, I have no idea whether that device does it or not. I don't know if it's encrypted. I don't know. None of that information, there's no product labeling for any of that. I was looking at cameras. I'm like, well, what kind of encryption is being used? None of that information is available on it. So unfortunately, I'm not saying we have to have like equivalent to nutritional labels on those devices, but those manufacturers should start putting that information on their packaging so that as a consumer, I know which one I'm going to buy. Otherwise, I'm going to have to go online, do my homework, try and figure out which vacuum cleaner is the best and has the best security before I go out and buy one, which makes me as a consumer less likely to implement a new vacuum cleaner or Ring doorbell or whatever it is that's out there in IoT. So as a consumer, I sort of have to do my homework. It's still kind of like buyer beware type of thing at this point in time. But hopefully, we're starting to see this happen with the UK, and hopefully that'll roll out across the world. So they're taking a lead on this, which is good. Now, there's also Siemens and some other groups who are on the industrial control side of things, the OT folks. They came up with something that's called the Charter of Trust, and they are industry leaders trying to address cybersecurity. And one of the things they're doing with this Charter of Trust, and we'll talk about the 10 principles they have, is to say, hey, we're committed to giving you devices as an original equipment manufacturer. We're committed to making sure that we make those devices secure, so when you implement them, that you know that they're secure, and if there is a vulnerability, we will patch it within. Now, here's one of the things that they have in their principles is a reasonable support life cycle. What do they mean by that? Now, that's, so I caught that one, right? So in their Charter of Trust, they said a reasonable life cycle. So what is reasonable? Well, if I am running a water treatment plant, my reasonable life cycle for support for the PLC unit that I just bought to run this pump is the life of the pump or the plant or, you know, whatever I've set out. So if I figured out that I'm going to run it for 20 years, I want support for that device for 20 years. I don't know that that's what they think reasonable means. So we need to make sure that when we're talking with folks that are going to be putting these items into our factories or our refineries or whatever we're getting, that we're talking to them about this life cycle of support and how long that support life cycle is going to be. That should be one of our first questions. Are they going to patch software? How long is that software going to support the hardware that we currently have? Because the hardware, now the software I expect to be updated on a regular basis to keep up with the new operating systems and all the new technology comes out with that. The hardware, I suspect, should be able to last the longest period of time possible with the new software supporting the older hardware, right? So we need to talk and have that conversation with the manufacturers. Because right now they got a great thing. The Charter of Trust is really good. They got the 10 principles that they have with it. They want to make sure there's ownership of cyber and IT security, and they suggest that the Chief Information Security Officer of an organization, whoever the top dog in cybersecurity is the person who oversees OT, IoT, and IT security. So their responsibilities are now being broadened. So I think that's a perfect example of a really good first step from the enterprise point of view. They say responsibility throughout the digital supply chain. So this is really good because we'll talk a little bit about supply chain in here and the risks related to that. So what does that mean for the manufacturers? The manufacturer may be a company in the UK or US, but it may be made in another manufacturer in another country. And we've heard stories where additional chips were found on motherboards that were not in the original plans when they were sent to another country to be manufactured, right? So that supply chain management, there's going to be some issues that they're going to have to deal with, the manufacturers. Secure by default, which is a great goal to have. User centricity, innovation and co-creation. In other words, working with other industry partners to come up with secure designs for devices, secure protocols, those types of things. Education. So education at all levels, not just for the consumer side of things or the enterprise side of things, but also for the industries that are building the technology and the hardware that we're relying on. Certification for critical infrastructure and solutions. So this is different in IT proper. We've had secure certifications since the 90s, right? You know, if you're running Microsoft stuff, there's a Microsoft certification. If you're running Cisco items, there's Cisco certifications. And so certifications have been around for a long period of time. The CISSP was, what, 1989 when they came out? So there's been certifications for all of this stuff. Now we're looking at specifically OT environments. This is not really applying to IoT, but for the operational technology, industrial control side of things, they're looking for certifications, and there are some certifications. We'll talk about those in a minute. They want to have transparency and response. So if there's vulnerabilities, they should be telling their clients that use their hardware and software that there's vulnerabilities, and that they should then come up with patches to fix it. They want to come up with a regulatory framework, which I think is really good. This is the first time that well, it's probably not the first time, but it's not often that an industry says, hey, we need laws for this. You know what I mean? So this is actually kind of a good thing, and I think it's good for the companies that want to do the right thing, but they get priced out of the market because people will always make cheaper, less secure items at a lower cost point, and some businesses are just going to go for those because security is sometimes something that people see as an unnecessary expense or an expense that can be cut. But coming up with a regulatory framework that says ICS systems or OT systems require this level of security is going to help drive the industry so that everybody's at least trying to make everything secure. And then coming up with joint initiatives, which the Charter of Trust is one of their joint initiatives. So working forward, going forward, this is industry leaders doing this, and so I really applaud them and commend them. Having been in IT and IT security for 2 decades now, over 2 decades, it's refreshing to see this. Now, this happened in IT a while ago, right? So it's nice that it's moving to all technology. Hopefully, IoT will be following too. So when you talk with OEM, the original equipment manufacturers and the vendors, we have a supply chain risks that they're going to have that we have to make sure that they're dealing with, right? Are they dealing with those hidden chips that someone puts on them, or and maybe it's not even just about breaking confidentiality. Maybe it's just about integrity. What level of requirements do they have to make sure that their systems have a certain level of reliability? Back in the day, there was 3Com. I'll pick on them since they don't exist anymore. 3Com used to have multiple different network adapter cards that you could buy, and they had a higher level one, which was a server level card, and it was always like 3 times more expensive. And when I was a 3Com partner, I went to training there, and one of the things that he told us about it, it's all about the quality control testing that they do for each of the devices. So the one that you can buy for $14.95, the network adapter card, does not go through any testing for quality control. They did testing on the original design. That's it. When you get to the highest level ones, the ones that are a couple $100s a piece, those ones go through, they get manufactured, and they take a certain percentage of the network adapter cards, and they run it to figure what the mean life cycle is for those devices. And so they like even guaranteed them out, or they said the mean lifetime for those devices was like 99 years. And I'm like, I'm not even going to use it for 99 years. But that's the level of quality that they were testing it at. And then when they got a shipment in from the factory that made them, they would actually test a percentage of them to make sure that they had that same level of quality. Now, in order to do that, you have to pay for the, right? So that's why it was 3 times more expensive. So this is the next thing. You're right. If you look at like a home vacuum cleaner on this side of things, they're not going to do any testing on it. The original design they're going to test is going to work, and they're going to spit it out. Doing high-end testing, I don't know that you're going to see a lot of that in your TVs or those types of devices, especially TVs because they're considered like disposable. You just throw it away and get a new one. On items that are like for OT, for plant security or treatment facilities or factory floors and building automation items, you're going to see a little higher level of quality in the devices. But at what level? Do they have different levels, right? So you may have to ask those questions, especially what the expected lifetime of the devices. Knowing that they actually calculate those items and they don't always advertise it. What is the expected lifetime of this hardware? Knowing what their software support and hardware life cycles are going to be, that's obviously we already talked about. Vulnerability reporting, something that I talked about earlier, and that is, are they going to report to you when they have a vulnerability so that you can then address the risk related to it, right? And are they going to have patches for it? And are they going to give you patches to fix those items if those items have problems in there? So what guidelines and standards are available out there? Well, so there's a number of different OT and I want to say IoT standards as well. Starting off, one of the biggest ones that's out there for the industrial control systems is ISA 62443 and NIST 882. Those are the 2 big ones. They specifically focus in on ICS systems. So that's the operational technology standard size. Also, the American Water Works Association has G430-14, which also is on the OT side of things. Now, for IoT standards, we have the UK Code of Practice right now, and then we have just regular IT security standards that you can apply to all of these other devices, NIST 853 and ISO 27001 or 27000 series of standards. All of those will address the common controls that you should have for IT, which also kind of applies to OT and IoT. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. And then the CSA has the Cloud Security Alliance, which you would think, why are they doing this? But they actually have secure guidance for early adopters of Internet of Things, and actually their guidance is actually quite good. So it does talk about supply chain issues. It does talk about businesses that are starting to use it. One thing I've also found is that consumer electronics that are designed for the home, vacuum cleaners, security cameras, doorbells, control systems for the AC or the environment, are now starting to trickle into the enterprise environment, into the business environment. Small to medium-sized businesses are not going in and buying the more expensive systems because they can just get the consumer level items and implement those instead of the higher-end enterprise. So what we end up seeing here is that consumer ones don't really have any of the standards. The developers, the original equipment manufacturers aren't following good design, secure by design standards. And so now we're introducing more risk into the corporate environment, unaware that we're really actually adding a lot more risk for those systems. So it's something we need to consider when we purchase items that we're going to put onto our networks. The ISA IEC 62443 standard is operational technology focused, so it doesn't really focus on the IoT side of things. And it aligns directly with other standards. So a lot of the requirements that it has that you should implement as an organization that's implementing the ICS system or the OT system, it actually aligns directly with NIST 853 and ISO 27000 series of controls. So it'll say that you need to, have something for malware protection, right? So, and how you implement an ICS system is going to be different than you may do on a network computer or some items like. But those controls actually align with it, and all the controls that they have listed in there, they align them with NIST and ISO standards. So, if you're reviewing this standard, you can go back and see how it aligns with other standards. And by the way, if you want to get this standard, I think they charge you for it. So it's like $100 some bucks or something like that to get the standards. And there's a whole bunch of standards with it. Now, the American Water Works Association is specifically for water, wastewater, and reuse utilities. And they have a secure practice for operations and management. They set forth what are considered minimum requirements for protective security. And it requires adoption on certain security controls. And the security controls that it really focuses in on, and I have to say, ANSI helps them make their standards, and their standard, the way they number things and arrange the standard itself is kind of a pain. NIST, in my estimation, does a much better job of listing out like a control catalog, 853, look at that as an example. This one, they have two different sections. They really have like 16 requirements, but they have it in two different sections, Section 4 and Section 5. And it's like, why don't you just have a section for controls, list out the controls, and put the controls in some kind of coherent pattern? Anyways, these are the 16 things that you need to do. Here's the 13 that are in Section 4. The organization has to have an explicit commitment to security. They should work to foster a secure culture within the water district or the wastewater district. They need to define security roles and responsibilities. They need to have an up-to-date risk assessment. They need to have access controls and intrusion detection. They need to have resource dedication for security and security implementation priorities. And then they have the fun stuff, right? They need to have containment, detection, monitoring, and surveillance. Contamination, sorry. Obviously, that's a specific thing for water because that's more of a human safety issue. They have to have information protection and continuity. They need to have design and construction with security in mind. They need to have threat level-based protocols. They need to have emergency response, recovery plans, and business continuity plans. They need to have internal and external communications and partnerships with other organizations. Then in Section 5, it says they need to have documentation for all these things. They need to have training for the individuals, and they need to do equipment testing. Now, all of those, and many, many more, all of those things are actually covered in other standards, ISO 27001 or NIST 853. All of those standards, if you're doing those control catalogs, you implement those controls, all those things are covered under those items. And this is one thing that I have to say about the American Water Works Association. This is the minimum requirements. So it doesn't mean that you're addressing all the risks if you implement these. It means that you're getting all the low-hanging fruit, so you need to go beyond that. So that's one thing to think about when you're implementing these standards is, are we doing enough, right? So that's for water districts and wastewater districts. What about medical devices? So now the healthcare public health sector coordinating council, so public-private partnership, came out with, in this year, January 2019, the Medical Device and IT Joint Security Plan, and they call it the Joint Security Plan, or JSP. And they are talking about a shared responsibility. They're talking about a shared responsibility between the community, the healthcare community as a whole, the individual organizations, and the original equipment manufacturers. So we're all in this together. We have to have a shared responsibility to protect this. And I applaud that. I think this is a great way to look at it. We have a shared responsibility together. The manufacturers, the community as a whole, and the individual healthcare organizations all have a shared responsibility in protecting patient data, protecting the devices that protect their lives, right? So we have a shared responsibility. I think it's probably the most mature perspective that I've seen in this. Now, medical devices are typically lumped in with the IoT devices because they're not really operational technology. And so remember, IoT doesn't have a lot of standards there yet. And this isn't really consumer technology. So the UK Code of Practice isn't really directed at this because it's not consumer. So it's kind of like the odd child out. But this is a voluntary plan, but it's a good plan for especially original equipment manufacturers to look at and make sure that they're following good cybersecurity practices in developing hardware and software that's going to be used in the medical field. It does cover things like governance. Remember at the beginning of this presentation I talked about IT governance and why doesn't that just extend to IoT and OT governance? And they're already talking about it. So they're kind of pushing forward in this. So I think we're going to find that you're going to have the highest level of maturity for IoT cybersecurity in the medical industry. On the OT side of things, I think that you're going to find a higher level of security around critical infrastructure such as communications, the power grid, and water treatments. Yet it still seems to be that there's a lot of work to do in those areas. Just because, especially here in the United States, report after report comes out saying how vulnerable we are in those critical infrastructure areas. I think that healthcare probably has the leg up on this because life safety is one of their issues, right? So people are like, I want to make sure that I can rely upon my pacemaker and that nobody can hack it and try and kill me. Yeah, maybe I'm just talking about movies, but there's been a couple movies where someone hacked into the pacemaker, or shows, TV shows, I don't remember which one it was. Someone hacks into it to make it look like a person had a heart attack or something. But anyways, So they're moving in the right direction. If you're an original equipment manufacturer for some type of healthcare device, I recommend that you look at that and probably adopt it. And if you're in the healthcare industry and you're purchasing healthcare equipment, that you're making sure that the people that you're buying items from are following these guidelines or their cybersecurity plan. And here's an example of their plan. I know it's really small and all the things. This is directly out of their thing, and this is where you can go and find their PDF. Kind of shows you, and if you look at it, it does talk, it is this partnership, so it does talk about the enterprise and their control structure, but it also talks about making sure the design and the development and the launch of the item is being done in a cyber secure fashion. Interesting thing too, they even talk about a maturity matrix, which if you've listened to some of my past presentations or some of my blog posts, I've talked about how maturity matrix of looking at how, because you can have a control and it can be implemented at a very low level, and then there's an optimized way of doing it, and there's like 5 different levels in there. They're actually adopting it. They're adopting the same CMM that quality control matrix that COBIT uses. So it's the same basic 5-level thing. So it's good to see that they're starting to adopt, we're talking about IoT and OT devices, and they're starting to adopt the existing standards that already exist in IT, which is probably what we should have been doing all along. So I thought about this when I was looking at all these different controls. There's some things that focus on IoT, some things focus on IT, and some things focusing on OT. And some of the different standards, some of them are voluntary, some of them are not. I'm looking at all of them, and what I've noticed is the most robust set of controls or control catalog is NIST 853. I noticed that almost every control that I've seen, other than the supply chain risk management, other than that, all the other controls I really see already listed out in NIST 853. So my idea is why don't we just take 853 and apply those controls? So if I'm implementing IoT or OT, why don't I implement NIST 853 controls on that with my regular IT? So I only have one set of controls and I apply it to everything. Makes my life a lot easier. Well, here's where this is where the rubber meets the road, and this is where it gets hard. But it's not difficult because 853, the control catalog, gives you the flexibility you need to apply it to your organization. The idea with 853 is, let's say one of the controls, SI3, I think it is, you have to have anti-malware protection. So something that's going to protect the device from malware. So now, if you have an ICS system or you have a PLC or SCADA, how do you implement malware protection for it, right? That becomes the question. Well, so you have choices when you implement controls from 853 to your organization. That is, you can do a risk assessment and determine that you accept the risk, or you can implement a compensating control. If there is no malware that's available for that device, you should still consider the fact that it still has the risk of being affected by malware. We still need to address what we're going to do to protect it from malware. Now, a compensating control might be something like intrusion prevention system that actually, if it sees malicious code going to or from the device, that it blocks that device from communicating any further so that people cannot hack into a system and then move laterally across a network, or if ransomware hits the OT or IoT device, that it doesn't infect other systems within it. So if you have an intrusion prevention system that has that can block that, maybe even maybe it has artificial intelligence to do that, that could be your compensating control. Now, it may not reduce all your risk to an acceptable level. Maybe it does. I don't know. That's your organization's individual risk tolerance. But implementing NIST 853, which is, by most industry standards, the most comprehensive set of controls, if you're doing all of those things, you're doing almost everything else, right? So my recommendation is make your life as easy as possible, do 853, and just apply it differently in different situations. like the American Water Works Association, their standards that they have, and then they also have voluntary standards for cybersecurity. Guess what? It's all 853. Everything that's in there is in 853. One thing that is slightly different is in the AWWA standard we just talked about. It talks about monitoring for contaminated water, which obviously for their particular business, that's a risk that they have. They're addressing it. But 853 would say you need to do a risk assessment and add any additional controls that are necessary. So guess what? It's still covered under 853. And some of the physical security things would still be covered under that, under 853. So if you're doing 853, you're doing 99% of what you need to be doing, no matter how you do it. Whether you're using the risk management framework that is required for the federal government use, or the cybersecurity framework, which is recommended for everybody to use, or you're using ISO 27001, or you're using COBIT, or you're using the ICS 62443, all of them align to it. So it's one standard that everything can kind of align to. There's mappings for all of these standards, so you can just pick one and kind of like stick to it. And then, you know, fill in any of the differences that you have. So one thing that you can do, what kind of occurred to me is like, all right, I'm going to tell people that they should do this. Now, how are they going to kind of bridge the gap between OT, IT, and IoT and make sure that we're doing the right things on all of them? Apart from what the original equipment manufacturer needs to do, that's being a separate issue. So what I've noticed about the cybersecurity framework, and what I think is good about it, I think the intent behind it was well-meaning. I think the way they executed it may have been a little bit off, because 853 already exists. I'm like, why don't you just tell people to use those controls, right? So why now you're telling everybody to do the cybersecurity framework? Well, the problem is the framework is not a standard, first thing. So it lists off a set of objectives that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to design controls that meet those objectives. Well, so that's when you have to go to a control catalog to find the control that you need to have to implement it. And guess where it points back to? 853 ISO 27001. So just implement NIST 853. I don't know. Anyways, I guess some people get wrapped around the axle because they say, well, this is federal government specific. Well, take the federal government specific stuff out of it, which is what they've actually been doing. They're making it much more generic. But anyways, so if you look at the cybersecurity framework, for each of their objectives that they list, like IDAM1, which is physical device and systems within the organizations or inventory, that's the first objective that they have. Here, the general security controls from the CIS, critical security controls, number one item on their 20 control list item is having an inventory of hardware and software. COBIT addresses this, which is from a governance perspective of having controls. From the OT side of things, ISA 62443 is addressing it on the OT side of things. And then 853 and ISO 27001 are attacking it from the IT side of things. So you can still have, you can see that these controls are all very similar. They map together. And what I like about the cybersecurity framework is that it maps the OT and the IT kind of together. You can kind of see from this one, having this inventory is covered by all the other standards, right? So it's already being addressed everywhere. One good thing about the cybersecurity framework, I think it can bridge the gap for many people. I like when people say, "Oh, we're following the cybersecurity framework," and then they don't pick a control catalog to follow. So that means they're inventing all the controls as they go. Somebody else has already done it. Adopt one of the controls, ISO or NIST 853. Pick one and do it is what I say. And the OT standards align with it as well. So you can make sure that you're kind of doing the same types of things all across the board. The issue that I talked about earlier about IT and engineers being kind of separate on these things, this is what can help them kind of come together too. Especially when you say, hey, my standard aligns with your standard, right? Because the engineers are going to be familiar with the ISA standard, and then the systems admins from the network side are going to should be aware of the NIST or ISO standards. Seeing that they all kind of align and work together, I think is a benefit of the cybersecurity framework. So if you take a look at those things, this is what the controls you'd want to implement to take care of those items. Did talk a little bit about certifications. There are certifications available for industrial control systems, and so not IoT, but this is for implementers and risk assessors, designists, and maintenance folks that are working in the industrial control systems, and they have different levels of certifications that you can get up to, and they have an expert level. And it talks about it's specific towards their standards, so it's a certification that is designed around their standards. So for OT side of things, this is what you want to look for people that are implementing your items and the vendors that are selling you the items. You want to make sure that they know what they're doing. And if you're going to have people assess you want to make sure that they have some type of certification. Now, someone can do assessments. You can have people that are like CISSP or CISAs do assessments. This one might have an advantage over those, is that this is specific to that specific standard. However, it's a very narrow certification. It only applies to ICS systems and only to that standard. So kind of a very narrow standard that's available out there for certifications. Other things, there's other websites out there that can give you information about vulnerabilities out there and what you may need to do with them. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency that was just spun off recently actually has an ICS part of their website where you can sign up to get updates on publicly available threat information on ICS systems and vulnerabilities that have been found. Those types of things are available. You can sign up for their website, on their website for this. Hopefully your manufacturers are passing that information along to you if you have any, but they may not be. So that's one place. There are other places, I can't get into all of them in this presentation, but I wanted to start with like one of the main ones that you can sign up for and get information and updates on industrial control systems. So your takeaway from all this is there are some standards out there, and they're starting to grow in maturity. They're starting to align with the IT stuff that are the IT standards and the IT practices that already exist. So if you want to grow and mature in IoT or ICS security, OT security, you're going to want to kind of follow what IT's already been doing, right? Get into the governance aspects, look at the security standards that already exist and say, how do these standards apply to what we have instead of reinventing the wheel? And then if there's anything missing, you add that on. So we also talked about supply chain, and we talked about life cycle of support for hardware and software. These are going to be our main things, is for us to put forth some pressure back on the manufacturers to make sure that they're designing devices that are going to be secure in the first place, and that they support them when vulnerabilities are found so that we can fix them. And that's what you want to mind what you have learned, save you it can, as Yoda would say, right? So I've been doing all the talking. I don't know, Rob, if you have anything to add to this. While he talks, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and send us the questions and we'll answer those. Do you have anything to add, Rob?
No, I think you did a pretty good job of outlining what we need to do as an industry. I added a couple of things to note. One of the big ones is part of the overview of the framework of getting cybersecurity training involved in every aspect of education, from basically elementary school all the way up into university programs, and that everyone needs to really do their part in helping to secure these devices.
Yeah, you know, I thought it was really interesting because what recently, I think President Trump signed an executive order saying that cybersecurity, we need to expand cybersecurity in the federal government, because they note that they have 300,000 jobs not filled in cybersecurity. And politics aside, it's true. We need cybersecurity, and our critical infrastructure is one of the areas where we're the weakest, and we know that they're the weakest. We've seen the reports. So making sure that we can get into and secure these items is going to be, I think, growing. Obviously, it's going to be growing. I'm talking about that for years. But I don't know, do you think that, I know that you said that teaching it at the elementary level all the way up, I agree. I think that that's one of the main things that we need to do. But what do you think we should do for manufacturers for IoT and OT devices to get them on board? Do you think that we need to have more legislation? Do you think that's going to work?
I think it's going to be a combination of an oversight committee of some kind, whether it's a government agency or whether it's an industry body, kind of like how PCI is, right? Has its
Right.
conglomerate of several different payment card issuers. Something like that where it's just the manufacturers of IoT get together to come up with some sort of consortium that says, look, these are how these devices should be created, how they should be manufactured, how they should be deployed, and if they don't meet it, here is the punishments for it. That's one side. And then the other side is those devices themselves, once they're manufactured and they get implemented somewhere, that it should go through an automated routine where it forces the end user to secure the device. Because the biggest problem they have is they don't know what the infrastructure is going to be like. So you code it so that it can connect, and then you force it through automated routines to start locking it down. So you type in what the admin password is going to be, you type in the configuration, you type in, there's that component of the device itself. But there's another area that we're kind of missing here, and that is the network itself has to be segmented to support these devices so that only the legitimate traffic that they have can go to where they need to go.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things I've noticed with my clients and even other folks and other industry leaders is that the segmenting of the network is easy on paper, hard in practice, right? Because you end up having to support, if you put an air gap between your network, first of all, that's no guarantee that it's going to keep hackers out, because we've seen them jump the air gap, but it's less likely that it'll happen, but it happens. What we see is that those systems, the control modules or whatever, the interface systems that are running on Windows or Linux that are displaying the control environment, the plant or whatever it is, those need to be managed as well. And so what ends up happening is they put those in the traditional IT environment, segment the network, and then let that device go into the IoT device, IoT network, or the OT network. And there's always ends up being this bridge, and then that bridge seems to be the weak link, right? So that becomes the challenge. Is like, how do I keep that all up to date if it's not on my network where it's automated, right? So if I have a Windows device and I'm using Windows Update services or whatever else I'm using to keep all my Windows devices up to date, if it's in a separate network and that network doesn't have access from them out to the internet, they're not going to get updated. So how do I keep them updated? So from a management point of view, this becomes difficult. Do I set up another updating server in that environment, or do I keep it in this environment, make a tunnel through? So in practice, there's a lot of options, but that's where the rubber meets the road, where it's a little bit more difficult, I think. And I think we'll see some changes in that. But yeah, I mean that's a part of the controls that are listed, right? That we should be looking at segmentation of networks and how to implement that to reduce our risk. Anyways, but we didn't get any questions, so I want to thank everybody for attending. Just wanted to let you know, hey, we can work together to help make the world cyber safe, and that's what we should do. And this webinar is suitable for continuing education if you do self-reporting. If you listen to the whole thing, Bright Talk has how long that you've been watched it or what percentage you completed, so that should be adequate for most continuing education reporting. This is not a vendor presentation. We're not selling anything, so we're just going over cybersecurity. in different aspects. We are a part of Stop Think Connect, which is a group of organizations, including the federal government, trying to make people more cyber safe and cyber aware and focus on cybersecurity. And please subscribe to our Bright Chat channel if you liked our presentation, and you can look at our contact blog. Rob and me maintain a blog. We don't blog too often, but we try to give you something worth something. So check it out, and please rate this session. Your feedback is valuable to us, and we appreciate it. And if there's any topic that you'd like us to talk about in the future, please don't hesitate to go to our blog and send us comments on what you'd like us to talk about. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Have a great day.